Welcome to this 213th edition of Europe Calling. I would like to give a special welcome to our guests today, who you can already see here and who I will introduce in more detail in a moment. I'm Maximilian. I am the Managing Director of Europe Calling, and I am the moderator. We're doing this with Goodforces today, and it is my honor that we have the pleasure of welcoming you today. It is your very first policy paper, and it is great that we can present it here at Europe Calling and can discuss it with citizens. But before we get started, a few housekeeping announcements. We are speaking German today, and to ensure that everyone understands everything, we have two interpreters. You can find the interpreting function under the small globe in the control bar.
English also. Welcome to this 213th edition of Europe Calling. Today we will speak mostly German. If you need English interpretation, please check out the little globe in the control panel and choose English. So, und dann, bin ja im Deutschen, zeige ich euch kurz,
Now back
wie
to
der
German.
heute so abläuft.
I will briefly show you how this evening will unfold. If I can find that slide I prepared.
Ja.
You should all be able to see it now.
Das war aber, ich glaube, ihr seht die Folie, aber mein PowerPoint will noch irgendwas von
For
mir.
some reason,
Seht sie?
it is still processing, but you can all see the slide.
Wir fangen wie immer an mit
As always,
Statements.
we're going to start with a few statements.
Heute möchte mein PowerPoint laden, sehr schön. Von
We're going
Nathan
to
Lauer,
start by Nathan Lauer, followed by Claudia Kemfert, Katharina Reuter, and Sascha Müller-Kraenner. After that, we'll have time for your questions and hopefully good answers. And we're going to try something new today. The last few times, a lot of people said, hey, we always hear really cool things at Europe Calling, but what can I do? How can I exert influence? And that is why we're going to reserve some time for the question, what can we do? How can I exert influence? At the very end, we're going to try to respond to this question during the last 10 minutes. You might also call this empowerment if you wanted to. And as always, it will all be recorded, after which it will be posted on YouTube and as a podcast online. So please consider this when you pose your questions. Oh, I almost forgot it. You can ask your questions on Slido. We have over 800 registrations, so we're going to get quite a few questions, so we need your help. Please rate the questions, and that allows us to ask the questions that are of greatest interest. That was it from me with regards to the housekeeping announcements. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our first speaker, Nathan Lauer, Head of Policy Analysis at the Goodforces. I won't say any more. People are always best at introducing themselves. Nathan, it's great that we managed to organize this webinar, and I look forward to what you have to say. Nathan. Thank you, Max, for this great introduction, and thank you for the organization. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully, you can all see the slide. Let's start. I work for the Goodforces. We are fairly new. We do policy analyses and political campaigning for the European Green Deal and for United Europe. And we now wrote this policy paper, and we got the help of the think tank Future Matters. It was commissioned also by Deutsche Umwelthilfe, the Environmental Action Germany. Perhaps I can give you an overview. Now, it is all about Europe's position in the global race, in the area of the energy and mobility transition. The question is whether the key technologies of the future, such as photovoltaic batteries, whether these will be produced here in Europe or whether we will have to import them. The EU's goal is fairly clear. Europe has decided to take a leading role when it comes to the clean revolution. This is what Ursula von der Leyen said. And this begs the question whether we are on track. As you can see here with this image, we would say that we are not on track. that we are actually currently being left behind. Why is that the case? Well, we took a look at three renewable energy supply chains in the framework of this policy paper. We focused on solar and wind power, the two biggest renewable energy technologies where we know that we need to expand these. These are the figures of the Repower EU plan of the European Commission. So hundreds of gigabytes that will have to be built until 2030 to achieve the climate goals. And then we also took a look at the power grids that are sometimes forgotten, but that are extremely important. They need to be expanded. We're going to need thousands of kilometers in order to ensure that the electrification of society becomes possible. Now, when it comes to this expansion, the problem is clear when you take a closer look. This is a simplified representation of the different production steps for a photovoltaic plant. Many of you probably have these panels on their roof, and we can see that in almost all of the production steps, China dominates. When it comes to ingots and wafers, they control almost all of the production capacities of the world. And to quantify this, a study suggests that 90% of the components for PV are imported from China. So if we were to have a shock event, for example, a conflict with Taiwan, comparable to the issue we had with Russian gas after the war of aggression in Ukraine, well, then the European ability to be successful in its transition would be very much hampered. So this is, of course, subject to criticism when it comes to the current situation. If we take a look at wind power, the situation is a bit less drastic because the transport costs are so high that the imports do not dominate all that much. But here it is important that we have access to these essential raw materials. But here too, China dominates. Here, a statistic with regards to the rare earth metals. As we can see, China still has an extremely dominant position when it comes to these raw materials. So the situation is pretty serious. And when it comes to the power grids, especially when it comes to the smart grid technologies, we need semiconductors. During the corona pandemic, we could already see what happens if issues arise along the supply chains. And there's also high demand of copper and aluminium. And here too, we very much depend on imports. So in summary, it can be said that we have these geopolitical dependencies, but we also have another problem, and these are the ethical aspects. They can differ according to the technology, but one of the big issues with the Chinese suppliers is forced labor. And the UN has said that there's a lot of forced labor veiled as labor programs. There are different ways in which the Chinese states structures this forced labor. That also means that solar energy in Germany is very much connected to this. And when it comes to the perma-magnets, when it comes to rare earth, and when it comes to the raw materials for the electricity grids, there are a lot of problems relating also to environmental destruction. Do take a look at environmental justice to find out what the issues are. So we do have these two issues at hand. And that leads to significant ecological and social damages if we were to continue implementing the energy transition as we have done hitherto. Yeah, we also took a look at the EU landscape. And of course, the EU loves its abbreviations. And some of you, just like I did, might have got lost in all these abbreviations, but two are of importance. The NZIA, the Net Zero Industry Act, and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Now, the Net Zero Industry Act is basically the supply chain expansion of the European Green Deal, which was announced in 2019, and the Net Zero Industry Act was published in March 2023. And its goal is that we aren't only successful in our energy transition, but that at the same time that we ramp up the national production capacities, and there are clear goals here. By 2030, 40% of the EU demand is to be produced in the EU. That's the goal. And the criticism is that the Net Zero Industry Act doesn't make available any funds for this, any new funds. So this isn't an investment offensive. It is more to be understood as an administrative streamlining processes. Yeah, the Net Zero Industry Act works as follows. It identifies projects and regions, and it aims to reduce bureaucracy and to speed up processes, hence making it easier for projects to get off the ground. But it doesn't make available new funds. It only redistributes existing means, especially from the European Green Deal investment plan. That is one of the big criticisms, which we will speak more about later. And the CS3D, which can also be called the European Supply Chain Act, it relates to the second point, the ethical considerations. Companies within the EU have to draft sustainability reports, and the CS3D aims to ensure that this reporting is also subject to a verification of the ethical issues. So companies have to do due diligence exercises, and if there are any issues, they basically have to combat these. And well, this directive works in harmony with others, which I won't mention now, but these are the bigger EU measures, the two bigger clusters that we took a look at, the Net Zero Industry Act and the CS3D. Now, coming back to this image, and the first important result of our analysis, and it is also in line with the criticism expressed in the Draghi report, and that is that the EU doesn't have a coherent industrial strategy. We have great programs, we have funds, but it's fragmented. It isn't being deployed coherently from a strategic perspective. Many companies also get lost in the different funding mechanisms, so we basically lack the one big throw. And this wouldn't be half bad if we weren't competing with two competitors that have this. China already for decades, Made in China 2025, perhaps one of the most famous industrial strategies. And they are, of course, trying their utmost to build on their leadership. But then we also have the Americans with the Inflation Reduction Act that they passed in 2022. This means that they set themselves up newly. They mobilized hundreds of billions with investment subsidies, with a lowering of taxes in order particularly to support clean tech. So they really set themselves up newly, and by 2030, they will largely be able to cover their national demand and will even be able to export when it comes to decisive technologies. And Europe also tried this. The Net Zero Industry Act was to be the big reply to the Inflation Reduction Act, but the EU did not succeed with this. And that leads to the situation we find ourselves in at the moment. And this also leads to the policy recommendations, i.e. what needs to happen for us to not lose track. I'll speak about two of them. I'd recommend reading the others in the policy paper. There are really two forms of investments that, in our opinion, are of utmost urgency for Europe to reposition itself and not to lose track. Starting off with having to close the funding gap. Now, there are different ways of calculating this. In our policy paper, we use an analysis of Roland Berger, which states that the capital expenditures, which we would have to mobilize in order to ensure that we reach the goals of the Net Zero Industry Act, well, we're talking about 575 billion euro. There are different figures, but what is clear is that we have a huge funding gap, and in our opinion, this can be done by efficiency gains, by reducing bureaucracy. But the EU forecasts also show that more investments have to be mobilized, and the Clean Industrial Deal gives us hope. You might have read about it in the news. This is Europe's opportunity to set itself up newly, to compensate the errors of the Net Zero Industry Act with a big industrial program. But here too, unfortunately, we do not know yet for sure. We'll get the proposals over the next weeks, but it seems like we'll be making the same mistake over again, that we focus too much on simplification processes, but that there isn't sufficient political will to make available the required means. And the EU has many good programs. We have many interesting, well-functioning programs that we could build on. Perhaps later we can talk about some of these in more detail. State aid, for example, for wind energy has been a success model. If we were to expand this to other technologies, if we use the public procurement system better. So there's a lot of financial room for maneuvering that the EU could use. And this is what is going to matter over the next years if we really want to achieve the goals of the Net Zero Industrial Act. Now, a second policy demand is a bit more complicated. It works slightly differently. And this brings us back to the CSDDD. This is something that is difficult for companies, understandably so, because there are a lot of there's a lack of legal clarity when it comes to the implementation. But in our opinion, this should also be understood as a type of investment. Now, we could be protectionist like the Americans or like the Chinese, or we focus on the EU's strengths and say, this vacuum left behind by the Americans, left behind by being protectionist, we can use this vacuum and we can position ourselves as a responsible trade partner. So instead of introducing tariffs, we allow for planning security via supply chain standards, hence showing that we're looking for trade agreements at a level playing field.
Eben nicht nur, wie man im Englischen sagt, local value extraction machen, also nicht nur Ressourcen.
It's not only about local value extraction. We really need to show that we also do local value addition, that we work together, and that we adhere to the ethical and ecological standards, showing that we trade in an open manner and open for diversification. Now, in summary, we know that we have to expand our renewable energies. That's clear. Nobody states that this would be possible, that the transition would be possible without it. But we also know that a lot of the raw materials aren't extracted in a responsible fashion. And we always say that we should consider these two ideas as a double investment, both when it comes to our credibility as a trade partner and our financial means. This would allow us to reach the goals that we very much must reach within the European Union. Thank you.
Noch gemutet. Erstmal kriegst du jetzt gleich noch ein paar Reaktionen und dann diskutieren wir.
A couple of reactions before we come to the discussion. Thank you for this presentation. Many of you don't know that my mother often listens to these webinars, and this time she wrote to me, she said, this presentation was really easy to follow, so that's really great praise that you were able to not just convince me, a policy nerd, but also my mother. So thank you for my mother. And now we have Claudia Kemfert, head of the Energy and Transport and Environment Department at the German Institute for Economic Research in Berlin. And I think she's also very suitable for mothers and fathers, of course, in her podcast, Kemfert's Climate Podcast. I listen to it while running. Lots of citizens asking questions during that podcast, so that's a recommendation from me. Now, Claudia, please. Thank you, Max. And please say hello to your mother as well. And thank you to Nathan for the presentation. Lots of points I agree with. And then maybe just a few aspects in terms of the competition policy and general economic policy. It really fits with the German and European industry policy. So in terms of competitiveness and dependencies that we are in for different reasons and different past decisions that have led us to such dependencies, especially with China, there has been a spiraling dependency in terms of raw materials, but also lots of products for solar and wind energy, and that's dangerous. Looking at the Russian war of aggression against the Ukraine, then the gas crisis, and then looking at risen cost of living in Germany and the economic down, that combined with the energy crisis that we're still in, obviously leads to some people saying that the green transition is at fault for this, but that's not at all the case. It's the energy crisis. So that was just a summary of the challenges we're faced with. And so we have multiple crises going on, and they are all the more reason to really implement the strategy that was mentioned. There are so many challenges. The energy crisis, where we just have this pressure to adapt, especially for energy-intensive sectors in Germany and Europe, in order to escape from this of the negative spiral, escape that negative spiral. But there are other challenges as well: demographic changes and conflicts and foreign trade, stronger competition, such dependencies, but also digitalization and decarbonization. So there are so many topics now that need attention because of the things that haven't been done over the last decades, I have to say, especially in Germany. So the pressure to finally adapt is very strong, and that is all the more reason to get the European policy framework right, so that this can work. And we have known it for years in Germany that we need economic investment, not just because of all these necessary transformations, but also because we need the German economy needs modernizing. And we've been putting this off for years, but it's also about infrastructure, digitalization, roads, bridges, in German, the Deutsche Bahn. We all know that it's always late. So these are the results of a lack of investments over the past decades. So we need this modernization now because we have rising competition and competitive pressure coming from China and the US. So we need more capital stock and a renewal. There was a study that we've also renewed by the colleagues of the industry and competition sectors, and they, in their study, also show that such investments are especially important because the capital stock in terms of knowledge or in real terms for Germany is a lot older than the average, in the international average. And that means investments are extremely important because €1 coming from public finances, public investment, will trigger up to €2 private investments. So there's a multiplying effect. The stronger we invest, for instance, in construction, the stronger the economy will get, and that will lead us out of this downward spiral. So we've heard some figures. We have similar figures, roughly in Agora, but also in the Draghi report. It has been made very clear that we need a lot of investment in order to meet these challenges. And looking back, we've always managed to somehow master challenges also with international competition. In the 70s it was the clothing industry, then in the 80s it was the entertainment industry that kind of left us. Then in the 90s it was the toy industry, now the financial crisis. But the industry is still there as the basis, and it should be strengthened so that we get more resilience. And so the question which sectors to strengthen and how to strengthen them has to be answered. So the services sector, but also the industry, of course, which has a major focus in Europe. And we can't just give it up as we did in the past for clothing. We do need to keep it here, so we have to redirect the delivery chains, the value chains, and we need more resilience. And the energy renewal is also a part of that. So the energy transition. So we have to build on the strategies we already have. We don't need more new frameworks, new acronyms. We have to build on what we already have. We have an industrial strategy 2030, and that was about broadening infrastructure, mobilize special skills, etc. So we have all that. We have the framework conditions that should be used further and strengthened in order to also mobilize private capital and facilitate innovations and get this kind of sovereignty or shrink our dependencies and thus protect ourselves against crises. And then cyber safety, I haven't even mentioned that. Cyber security, sorry. So there have been programs in the past that led to new investment and with competence centers, and we could build on that in order to make progress. Then remember the high-tech strategy from 2006. That concerned health, mobility, communication, or the investment funds for future technology that started in 2019. We have the agency for piloting innovations, etc. So we should build on all of that to get where we want to go. So 575 million euros with Nathan said. The Draghi report says 800 to 900 million euros, but that's the kind of investment, the amounts that we will need to also increase our security and reduce our dependencies. And apart from energy, I would like to also specifically mention AI, digitalization, and critical raw materials. These three we can only manage if we have a capital market union. So in that point, we agree with the Draghi report and also a joint debt in Europe. It doesn't make any sense to have the German debt break here. We should not just save and save and save in times of crises and others are overtaking us. We can use this time and use Europe's strength, but hopefully it will also keep so that we don't waste these strengths but maintain them. Also in times of President Trump, and he may forget about a green economy, so that could also lead to us focusing more on it. So my compliment, and I really agree with your study at many points, and I would advise to focus on that even more, especially the topic of investments. Thank you, Claudia. I have seen a couple of questions. Anonymous user. Please just give yourself a name because I don't like saying anonymous user. But okay, so the question here was, what do you mean when you say capital stock? Well, that's just the capital an enterprise has, a company has, or in terms of public economy, it's the kind of capital that an economy has in terms of knowledge, in terms of equipment or buildings. So you have material capital, but also immaterial, intangible. So material capital would be buildings or equipment, and immaterial, intangible would be knowledge, research, competencies, and that's the economic capital stock, the capital stock of an economy. Thank you. That's a really beautiful, very German word. Let's continue with Katharina Reuter. She is Managing Director of the German Sustainable Business Association, and I think she's been in that post for 30. This business association is 33 years old, and they say they are the voice of sustainable economy. And many members. Katharina can say something about that. So this is the voice of sustainable companies, and Katharina will tell us what these companies need. So and they represent much more than just the 500,000 jobs that they mentioned on their website. Thank you for this introduction. Maybe let me continue with the jobs that you mentioned. I mean, it's more than 200,000. I think at this point we should update this on the website. So looking at the current debate. So we have some of the current jobs being lost in industry. And then there's always this argument that new jobs are being created because of circular economy, energy efficiency. And at the moment, we still have value creation in Germany or in Europe. In these types of industries, we still have European or German companies, and also for clean tech patents, we are still ahead in Europe or in Germany, but we won't be in that position for much longer if we don't work for it, because others are catching up and we're not doing much to stay ahead. So Max, you mentioned it briefly. We have this backlash, not just in Germany and Europe, but really globally against the topics of sustainability and climate protection. So that's something that worries us. So Amazon, etc., are now stopping their diversity programs and their diversity policies. I mean, that's just crazy. So it's about gender equality, etc. Apparently, that's no longer fashionable. So it really isn't a very progressive development that we're seeing globally. And so people now say, the narrative is that the economy is down because of climate protection, and I think that's very dangerous, because you're forgetting here that we have the infrastructure crisis, the export crisis, and they're really majorly responsible for any economic downturn, not a climate policy, not sustainability policy. So talking about German industrial policy and decarbonization, it has become clear that there's always this insecurity created in the economy and business because politicians are just turning about all the time. So we now have a member of the government who doesn't believe in green steel. In the relevant minister. So there are these ideologies that play a role. So thank you for the study, and we agree with many of your points, as our association is also has some clear thoughts on the debt brake that we've set out over the past years. So we know we need investment, not just in Germany, but in Europe as a whole. And one core recommendation of your study to strengthen sustainability, well, of course, we would agree with that strongly, not surprisingly, because, I mean, we all agree we have to be faster in climate protection and not slow down. And we also all agree that economic success should be measured in a different way in the future. But that also means measuring entrepreneurial success in the future, and CSDDD is very important in that respect. And let me add the following. In the Draghi report, Mr. Draghi focuses again and again on the interior market, the EU interior market. So at the moment, we have this fragmentation, and that costs us 10% of the potential. So if we had modernization here, investment, decarbonization, and circular economy, and really created a level playing field, that would really help us a lot. So I have listed 5 points that are important from our point of view. So first point, decarbonization of the industry and expanding renewable energies. So I'm sure we all agree that we need to make our networks fit and our store capacity as well. So network capacity is one of 3 central barriers in this area, and it's not just infrastructure for energy, but also for hydrogen. That's important here, not just for electricity. And of course, steel and chemistry are very important for hydrogen, and they use up a lot of energy. And then during election campaigns over the past years, decades, we've always heard these talks and discussions about the CO2 price. And having being able to plan is very important for businesses, because we have very long amortization periods, too long. So we need to know exactly where we're going. We need to be able to plan and depend on what's being announced. And if you're looking at ETS2, I mean, luckily it looks like this time schedule of achieving it by 2027 is something that's still supported also by conservative parties in the EP. But if we don't have any concrete schedules by the summer, we're going to be in trouble if we're trying to implement this in a socially acceptable manner. It's going to be difficult. So I've already pointed out energy efficiency, and yesterday I'm in the Advisory Council for DENEF, the German energy efficiency. So yesterday we published a call upon the government, because in the energy efficiency law, it sort of this law already makes it clear that we would now, as a next step, need very concrete funding programs in order to also expand our networks, because we would also be able to save some costs in terms of networks if they were fitter. And then that brings me to my second point in terms of what's important to our European umbrella organization as well. Infrastructure for recycling. We need to create that, and we need fast measures. We need to take measures quickly to not lose all of these recycling companies, because the first of those plants are already closing. And they're saying, well, we need more recycled, and that's kind of counterproductive. So we have binding objectives at EU level for resource efficiency and reducing waste. And I mentioned the topic of jobs earlier. So the potential is 700,000 new jobs by 2030. That much could be created. So we have these three topics: jobs, saving measures, CO2, and a real EU interior market. Raw materials, for instance. If we're implementing a circular economy here, we would be able to keep that in Europe. And talking about recycled, in India, from the 1st of January of this year, they've introduced relevant quotas for using recycled material. So that creates a market. And we still have the problem that there's no tax on petroleum here. I mean, it's absurd for companies. They want to use recycled materials, and that's twice as expensive than virgin plastic. So in preparation for tonight, another thing I saw were the European battery lines, and you can see the strategic cooperation and European industrial alliances, and that makes a lot of sense for key areas in our transformation. So renewable energies, but also AI and medical technology. We do need to work together with others. And then just let me mention sustainable financing briefly. In February, we will have the omnibus procedure in Brussels with the CSDD, and other regulations will just be put in one big pot, stirred and shaken. And, well, of course, it serves some harmonization, which we would welcome, but if this procedure leads to things being diluted or only applied for companies larger than 1,000 staff members, then that would be a mistake, we believe. We know that banks and customers want to know whether the companies are sustainable. So the EU taxonomy is the key here, and it has to be become more precise and expanded. This private investment should also be steered into greener projects, and then sustainable purchasing. There have been first positive steps with the transformation package for public procurement, but this could be like a catalyst for products and companies using future-proof technology. So we have to do more in the area of public procurement. And that was all from me, and I'm looking forward to a further discussion.
Thank you. One question with regards to a figure, just to be sure that everyone understood it. You said the fragmentation in Europe costs 10% of the GDP potential. Could you perhaps explain in more detail what exactly that means. We regularly complain about economic growth.
Wirtschaftswachstum und Wohlstand so messen wie bisher, ob wir dann da nicht eben auch an Grenzen kommen. Aber nehmen wir mal dieses alte System.
Let's take that old system, even though some argue that it is no longer up to date, but there are crazy factors that influence this. For example, the absenteeism rate in Germany. If it wasn't for the absenteeism, we would have had an economic growth of X in 2024, and the same thing is the case if between the member states the internal market wasn't as fragmented with the different rules and with the different barriers and challenges, then it would be 10% higher. But we can also speak about this in more detail later on. So we're talking about quite a few billions. Right. Thank you very much. We're now going to move on to our last speaker. Many who join us regularly know him, Sascha Müller-Kraenner, Federal Managing Director of the influential NGO Deutsche Umwelthilfe, Environmental Action Germany. And on your homepage, it says we mobilize the public and also speak about unpleasant truth. And we already organized a campaign to prevent the conservative side of the political spectrum from banning you, which is, of course, we do not want. So thank you very much for joining us, for saying something about your NGO. Well, thank you very much for this invitation. And it's great that there's so much interest. We're going to turn 50 this year, and we intend to continue for another 50 years. So we won't be banned and we won't be scared.
Ich hoffe ja, dass es auch noch ein bisschen Diskussion gibt.
Now, hopefully there's going to be time for discussion afterwards.
Vielleicht zu Anfang mal sagen, warum haben wir denn dieses
So perhaps I'll start with the question, why did we also commission this paper that Nathan presented? Why does our NGO deal with industrial policy? Well, because we want to have a climate-neutral country. And this, of course, includes all kinds of aspects, but it also means that we have to have a transition in our energy and transport system. And that is only going to work if we have the means to do so.
Alle die Zukunftsindustrien, die wir dann auch brauchen,
we're going to need all kinds of future industries. We're going to have to produce the solar panels, the heat pumps, the electric vehicles, etc. And if we do not have a minimum of control of these industries, then this is simply not going to work. Because let's not be fooled. This imagination that we're going to have this transition towards climate neutrality, this is something that not everyone supports. For example, Donald Trump, who is engaging in an economic war with the EU. Donald Trump has announced that he doesn't want wind power to be built in the US, but that he expects Europeans to buy more liquid gas in the future. And Donald Trump is one of these people whose sometimes crazy-sounding announcements should be taken seriously. That is why it is important to protect our future industrial sectors. And wherever we've lost grounds, it is essential that we catch up. And for this, we need to regain control over our climate policies and maintain our sovereignty. In my viewpoint, this is also one of the central messages for this party campaign. We need a government that doesn't say the market is going to fix it, we're going to buy the stuff on the world market, the invisible hand of the market will reign, but that's not going to happen. And in the rest of Europe, nobody understands that Germany blindly believes in the market and the technology neutrality. Everyone knows, the French know it, and the European Commission also knows it. You have to protect your own industry, and you have to invest into the future of your industry. Otherwise, it won't happen. And this is also what Nathan said. Others are doing this already with hundreds of billions. The Chinese, the Americans, the Indians, and many more know a little about how to invest into the future. And there's a competition here. And that is also why I truly hope that it is going to happen here. And that is why we commissioned this study, in order to see how this might look like. We have this Net Zero Industry Act, this re-industrialization plan. And at the moment, it's only a piece of paper with very little behind it. Okay, it contains a lot of ideas, but we all have good ideas. So we asked the question, what actually needs to happen? And the first thing that needs to be done is that we need to decide what industry we want to have here. And that shouldn't be yesterday's industry. We should think about what the industry of tomorrow might look like. And it's worth looking at China. The Chinese at some point decided that cars with combustion engines are going to be built elsewhere. But what about in 15 or 20 years? We're simply going to jump over this phase and invest into electric vehicles. And that also explains this graphic that Nathan showed. In all of the production steps, for example, when it comes to photovoltaics, the Chinese really control this production process. And that was very clever indeed. And this is done with dumping prices, with state aid, in order to develop economic monopolies. And I can tell you, this won't end well. We saw this when it came to our dependency on Russian gas. We didn't fare well there either. So it is a huge risk, and it's a mystery to me why this cannot be seen. So we have to decide what industries we want to promote in the future, because we don't have endless money and resources. So it's going to be a difficult debate. In this paper, we decided to focus on 3: solar, wind, and grids. Because of course, our NGO very much works on all of these areas. There's other areas that are of importance, hydrogen, circular economy, for example. Now, in Europe, there are also countries, governments that say, okay, nuclear power is our future technology. So these two need to be equipped with funds from Brussels. So this too begs the question, what direction do we want to go down? This is a political decision. And nuclear power was always subsidized from the onset. It was the result of a military technology, and there isn't a fair competition there. That's the one thing. And then secondly, we really need more money. The debt brake, this austerity measure, needs to disappear. This is really hard to believe in other parts of Europe. Nobody understands it at the IMF. Nobody understands it in the US. Donald Trump now said that the debt ceiling in the US also has to disappear. So sticking to this debt brake simply doesn't make any economic sense. Claudia Kemfert is better at explaining this because she studied economics. But perhaps we'll have more time for this during our discussion. One more thing, and you really did a great job at working on this in your study. There's the supply side, and then there's the demand side. In my opinion, it's extremely important that we do something on the demand side, that we create incentives for people to buy PV panels, but we also have to have the supply. And ideally, we should have a number of European European suppliers that take care of the supply side of the equation. Otherwise, it is going to get very difficult, so we need both. And last but not least, and that's also why we said all of this isn't taking place in a vacuum. It's not about controlling the things ourselves in Europe. For me, and I think many people agree with me, it's also about having quality standards. And what I mean with this is that these products are also produced in decent conditions, with minimum social standards, with minimum wages. And let me put it this way. In the forced labor camps in Western China, the German minimum wage isn't paid. And that is why the photovoltaic technology produced there is a lot cheaper than the one produced in Germany. And then we also have to add the ecological criteria. And I think we need some political steering for this. I'd be very pleased if during the election campaign, which we find ourselves in, I'd be very pleased if these things play a role when it comes to the future of the German economy, which is why I also look forward to our joint discussion this evening. Thank you.
Ja, danke dir. Bin jetzt
Thank you.
schon mal durch die Fragen durchgegangen. Wir haben
I took a look at the questions. We already have 30 questions, which is great. And we now have 25 minutes in order to answer the questions. I won't start at the beginning. I'm going to start with the following question. Hier Kick asked the following question. Does it make sense in the current situation to produce 80 million cars, regardless of whether they are ICE cars or electric vehicles? What could replace such a business in order to remain competitive?
Ich glaube, Peter hat sie hier auch einmal gestellt.
I think Peter also asked a similar question. The question is, what kind of businesses do we want to promote? What does the future actually look like? All of you refer to the automotive industry. Isn't it time to say, in light of the decreasing sales, we have to tell the European car makers that was it? Can the automotive industry in Europe still be saved? Perhaps Claudia Kemfert can reply to this question first. I'll always ask the questions, and then I'll ask one person to respond to the question, and then if other panelists also want to take the floor, they can simply raise their hand. So, is the truth, the hidden truth perhaps, that we have reached the end? This question is regularly posed. What is going to happen to the European automotive industry? Now, saying that this was it, economically speaking, this cannot be justified. I alluded to the structural change before, which is definitely taking place. And we've had a few experiences with this, but the automotive sector is, of course, an extremely important industry, economically speaking, which is now subject to structural change, indeed. And the sector is changing, and many studies have shown that in the future, we won't only have personal passenger cars. The future really lies in the area of individual mobility. And this can ensue in shared cars or in individual cars, but is also very much based on digitalization and infrastructure. And this is also what we mentioned repeatedly, digitalization, expansion of AI infrastructure. That's exactly what we need. And the automotive sector will play a role here. In the future, it will have to offer more mobility services if it manages to also transition towards more electric mobility. But indeed, this will lead to fewer cars, to lighter cars, to more efficient cars. that might be shared and that also offer mobility services. Some of the German car makers are already trying this. Volkswagen, for example, with Moja, or others, where smaller buses drive electrically in an autonomous fashion. These are concepts that can work if the market changes at large. But the pressure is great, especially from China, not only when it comes to wind and solar power, also when it comes to electric mobility, where they're producing at dumping prices and throwing cars on the European market. And the countries are now looking for responses to this. France, for example, that only offers incentives for European cars or with electric social leasing programs for low-income earners. These are the types of programs where we can support the European automotive sector, but it is going to be difficult. There will be a structural change and we'll move away from the mere centric or car-centric mobility towards a service-centric mobility. Very interesting. Allow me to say one more thing. It's very interesting to see what the automotive sector is doing. There's now an initiative of 3 German states where BMW, Mercedes, and Volkswagen are located. And these 3 car makers exceeded the fleet threshold, and the idea is now for them to not have to pay these fines, and other countries, other states such as North Rhine-Westphalia, isn't joining in because Ford has a big site close to Cologne. So this state is indeed sticking to these thresholds. So there are car makers that are also adhering to European laws and others aren't, and this should have consequences. This is something I wanted to say with regards to the automotive industry, an interesting observation. But Katharina wanted to take the floor. Thank you. 2 observations, 2 things I would like to add. Today, I learned that the ecological food society is offering as many jobs together with the renewable energy sector as the automotive sector. When it comes to cars, of course, in Germany, we are, for example, the only ones without a speed limit, so we are somewhat special. But this question also suggests we have to have less motorized individual transport. And then the question is also, what kind of cars do we want to build in Europe in the future? And when it comes to the economy, the EPP now wants to take back the end of the combustion engine in Europe. And the argument is that in South America, one wants to continue buying cars with combustion engines. So one seems to be unable to recognize that the markets of the future are going to look differently if we have a decarbonized economy. And with a view of the German car makers, it also has to be said that they were in hibernation. And the effects, of course, are dramatic. And every job that is lost is a tragedy. But they are responsible for it because they thought that they could simply carry on with a business model of the past without focusing on the future technologies, which would have allowed them to really be in line with the latest innovative developments. It wasn't only hibernation. When it comes to Volkswagen, it was a crime. Sometimes we forget the exhaust scandal when it comes to this topic. But billions were destroyed here. Millions of consumers were misled, but also billions that would have been required for this investment. But here too, politicians protected the car makers, meaning that they didn't have any severe consequences. It led to a lot of lost money to protect a sort of faked combustion engine. And this is my next question.
Unter anderem hier von Lutz Bahl-Belitz.
Lutz Bahl-Belitz, for example, asked, why does our green know-how not find its way onto the political level? Why isn't it used in the political campaigns? And we also have other questions relating to the why, because well, we talked about the cars, but in Germany and in Europe, we had a very high-performing solar industry. So there is this question of why. Why do we find ourselves in the situation we are in Europe? What interests, perhaps, have led to this? Sascha, would you?
Ja, ich glaube, das sind zwei Dinge. Das eine ist,
I think there's two things here.
das ist ja jetzt keine so originelle Einsicht. Das ist ja inzwischen jetzt auch viel beschrieben worden, dass sich jetzt gerade Deutschland
Well, it
einfach
has been
darauf
said
ausruht,
regularly
dass es immer
that
ganz gut funktioniert.
Germany
Natürlich ist
rested on
auch
its
Russland
laurels,
dann Exportweltmeister. Und
cheap
Exportweltmeister
gas
sind
from
dann
Russia, and then
billig.
export
Also,
champion, and
da
exports
man,
meant
was
chemical
ich
products and
Bild finde,
cars.
ist, wenn man, da kann man sich erkundigen, steht übrigens in der Regel dann auch auf der Website des Bundeskanzleramtes, wenn der Bundeskanzler oder die Bundeskanzlerin, ja, die letzten 16 Jahre, wenn ich die
Well, it can also
Weltgeschichte
be read
geflogen ist, immer mit
on
großen Industrievertretern, aber jetzt nicht die Deutsche
the website of the Chancellor.
sondern war dann Bayer dabei, und BASF, und die Automobilkonzerne und die Maschinenbauer und diese Sachen.
All kinds of
Und das zeigt
actors
genau
have been
die
promoted,
Art und Weise der
and
Wertschätzung. Also
this really
Robert
shows
Habeck jetzt mal gemacht, dass er auch mal Leute aus dem
was
Startup-Bereich
being
mitgenommen hat.
appreciated.
Einmal
Now, Robert
sind
Habeck
viele
also
Videos
took
drin
along
mit Frauen, mitunter
a few of the
mit
startups,
aber Olaf Scholz macht das nicht so. Und das zeigt schon auch so diese
but
Denke.
Olaf Scholz doesn't seem to be focusing all that much on the
So,
startups.
was ist eine echte Wirtschaft und was
So
ist
people do
irgendwie
seem to think, okay, what is the real economy and what is a
das
hobby?
war nicht ernst. Das war
And they really
in
don't
Deutschland
seem to be
so lange
taking it
Erfolg,
seriously.
die sind
Because Germany was so successful with these big industries for so long,
das glaube ich das eine.
there's this sort of narrow-minded approach.
Wir haben ja schon vorgestern mal so eine Diskussion gemacht. Da hat man das
Nathan
ja
and
auch
I had a discussion 2 days ago, and we had someone there from the startup
der Forschung ist Deutschland total spitze.
who also said that in terms of research, Germany is doing very well. Lots of patents with the Fraunhofer Institutes, great research landscape.
Woran es auch immer liegt, ob das jetzt daran liegt, dass es so parastaatliche Einrichtungen sind, der Transfer.
But there is an issue of the transfer which rarely succeeds.
Also gibt es ja recht viele Startups.
There are
Berlin
quite a
ist
few
Startup,
startups
München gibt es auch viel.
in Berlin and in Munich, for example,
Die werden dann nicht größer. Also
but they do not grow. So there's also a lack of funding. There's a lack of public funding. There's a lack of private funding.
So ein Einhorn wird und ein bisschen was Größeres. Es gibt dann immer so ein paar.
This is what means that this is what leads to these startups not becoming unicorns. Some manage, but most do not. And a lot of them simply go abroad or they're bought up by international companies. And I think we can only remedy this situation
es politisch schaffen und auch durch die Förderinstrumente,
if we allow for the right funding.
dass man Banken, also vielleicht dann auch nochmal mit einem kleinen Tritt in den Hintern von der KfW, die
Banks also need to be pressured a little bit to make available credits. This is the only way for us to also fund these future technologies. We shouldn't only say, okay, this is risky, small companies often go broke, because otherwise we'll only have the big players left in the future.
Ja, hat gefühlt, Geld ist da, aber nur wenn es ums Flugtaxi geht.
Well, would that be true, but just for the airport taxi?
Wir haben es in der
So,
jetzt nicht super detailliert
Well, we did not really go into detail with as far as financing, but there is an imbalance in Europe in financing structures. There's a lot of financing for the first and innovative phase, research and development, developing new technologies, where Germany is really a global leader, tons of patents, but then they really don't get to the market and are not scaled up, and that is also due to the structure of these financing instruments. So the money is kind of bound to structural guarantees. And so some technical fixes could be used at the European level. For instance, the EIB using state security and guarantees for such new technologies that would really unlock a lot of private capital with very little state help. So that's a major difference between the Inflation Reduction Act in the USA and the European funding system, that it's much easier for larger companies to get to the funding in Europe. But the IRA has a very simple structure, very simple procedures, cutting red tape. So there's just an enormous barrier to even get to any funding in Europe. And for bigger companies, obviously, it's easier to do that than for smaller ones. And so that could be one starting point, also working with tax credits, etc., to help or support more. So we'd have to change our mindset in terms of not just thinking about profitable investments, but also look at the next 10 years. So we have to invest today for what we want to happen in the next 10 years, so that we're not losing out. Thank you. But that's exactly the point that's often forgotten in the discussions, looking at China and the US and comparing them to the EU. So the US, of course, can adopt tax credits. The IRS has just one fiscal authority, and a large part of the 500 billion goes into tax credits. But in the EU, we have individual member states working with their own tax credits. So there are no central European taxes apart, so owned resources apart from very few areas. So sometimes it's a little bit unfair to judge this kind of federation of 27 sovereign nations. And Claudia Kemfert also talked about capital markets. Of course, we want to harmonize more, strengthen our ties, but it is a really federal issue that we're having. I mean, it's not like I have a solution here, but you can't really compare the US and to the EU and to adopt our own Inflation Reduction Act, because we're not one country. So it's comparing apples and pears. So the central money, where does the money come from? I don't think that the way the EU is structured now, that this would be possible in the same way as the US. And I don't think I'm the only one. Maybe we could talk about that briefly. So where is the money, what should the money come from that all of you want, Katharina?
Ja, unter anderem, dass man natürlich gut erkennen kann.
Well, among other things, we should be able to recognize what constitutes a type of future-proof investment. And another question. I talked about public procurement, and so we are super happy when we see startups and they win competitions, etc. But in public procurement, for instance, do we have any rules that we should use Ecosia and not Google as a search engine in Europe? These are things that are forgotten. And maybe Ecosia has won an award and had their shoulders patted. Oh, great that you're doing this. But they're not really being used at all in public institutions and public administration. And the question that you read out Max. I understood it a bit larger on the meta level. So why doesn't it work? Why don't we have better decisions, more courageous policy frameworks? So the analysis of the last few decades, I think we have three reasons. Things are being ignored and repressed, then money and power. And money and power structures have a lot of interest in maintaining the fossil model, and this long-term thinking that doesn't work with election periods. So if you're looking to be successful within a few years, then of course longer-term projects and measures are losing out in comparison to that. And sometimes when I hear things like, it's not like this is the end of the world, I sometimes think people don't know about planetary limits. Maybe that's really a kind of lack of know-how, really, a lack of knowledge. Claudia? In addition to what's already been said, two more points that I think are important. So you correctly, and Nathan also talked about better access to funding for companies. I mentioned the Capital Market Union, which is also a recommendation in the Draghi report in order to mobilize funds. So of course, we're very different countries in Europe, but that's also our strength in Europe, or it could be. I mean, it means we also have to pull ourselves together and get the means in order to be able to make these investments. And it would be possible. There could be projects of common interest and joint efforts in order to support more risky projects or investments. So it should be possible. In terms of the framework conditions, I think developments are rather positive, but of course, management is really backward facing. I mean, in the automotive industry, huge mistakes have been made and they still are being made. They are committed fraud and very dependent on sort of combustion engine driven profits, etc. So the fleet limits cannot be exceeded, and they're just trying to evade and avoid being found out when they do exceed the limits. And there's a lack of diversity, they're very risk averse, and really just having huge successes with the lobbyism. And that has been mentioned as well. Larger companies have these very strong connections to politicians, and they time and time again get their way. And those who have new companies and startups who start with real innovation, then SMEs, those are the ones that can take the necessary steps to the future, but they are hindered in their progress, and that's this kind of backward thinking is a very typical German phenomenon, I think. And that's a problem in the companies, inside the mindset of the companies. And I think we don't talk about that enough, and there's not enough of corrective measures for that. It's kind of backward-facing decisions. I could also mention the steel sector, but let's not. We have a similar problem there, that innovative forces just can't gain momentum. Thank you. Just one more thing before we get to our last round. Klaus von Wahn has asked a question. I think it's mostly been answered, but I'll still read it out because it's our top question. He says, the necessary investment in European infrastructure could be strengthened by PPPs, And industry does have the technology competence, and they want to get away from fossil energies. It's more a statement, I think, has received the most votes. And then Roger Pelter, that's our second top question, second to the top. So does it even make sense, he asks, to build our own production and manufacturing? We've already addressed that as well. I think we've addressed most issues really that are mentioned here. But before we get to this last little round, to mention one more topic. We've talked a lot about the industry, diversification. Diversification was a term that we've heard a lot tonight, and then services. Services. Well, we call the service sector the tertiary sector in Germany. So it's the one that comes third after the first and second, which is kind of telling. So in 2024, the economy shrank in Germany, but the service sector actually grew by 0.8% only, but still, I mean, if that was a total growth, that would be quite positive, especially communication and IT. Digital industry has grown, and public administration for education and health, and civil engineering. They contributed to that as well. A question to Nathan. This focus, heavy focus on our industrial core and manufacturing industrial policy, does it make us forget sometimes about other important factors in our economy? Because look at Silicon Valley, they don't really manufacture anything, but still a lot of value is being created there. So maybe is that something that we're forgetting, focusing more on services and asking what type of economy do we need in the future in Europe? It's a very interesting question. And it always reminds me of Spain. They had very positive figures for their economy in 2024 because they focused so much on services, and that's why Spain is now a model for Europe. I can only recommend looking at that, at Spain's story there, example. But we also kind of hold and keep to industrial ideas and ways that haven't proved successful. We like to do that in Germany. And, well, the economy of the future, I'm talking about that. We did not just look at investment in a strong economy, but it's also the security. Security is an aspect. Getting rid of such dependency, because if we can't control the capacities in order to implement our energy transitions, we won't be able to implement it, and that would create do a lot more damage in our economy. Gigantic natural catastrophes that cost a lot of money and hurt our economy as well. So yes, a different type of economy focusing more on services, that's a very legitimate question, but it should not be an alternative to a clear focus on Europe developing its own capacities in order to implement the energy transition. We can't just protect what we still have, but we really have to think ahead. What do we need in future? What will we need? These enormous competences that we have aren't always used to the full. So let's start our last topic. What kind of influence do I have? What can I do? So we're just going backwards through our panelists now. It's our last little round. You all have 1 or 2 minutes now to tell our audience what they personally could do in order to influence things, in order to change things, no matter what area. Sascha, Müller-Kraenner. What do you think about that? So we said it, if we want a flourishing economy, we have supply and demand. So demand, that basically means that we as the public invest in things, and many people do that by having solar panels on their roof, etc. So this kind of citizens' energy that people just get up and do the things on their own, that might not be the solution in terms of our economy, but it sets a signal, a strong signal, and it might lead to companies investing more. And then, of course, we have federal elections soon. Maybe we could focus on which parties are talking about the industry of the past and which ones are talking about the industry of the future. So, next speaker, Katharina.
Ja, oh Gott, die Liste ist ja so
Well,
lang. Also,
this list is quite long.
granular anfangen. Und ich meine, nehmen wir das
I
Beispiel
mean,
Ecosia. Wir können mit Ecosia.
For instance, Ecosia, we could use that as a search engine instead of Google, and then PV heating points. Well, not every single person would have a house to install a heat pump, of course. So what are smaller things we can do? I'm wondering. For instance, in the field of mobility, there really is a lot that can be done at the personal level. Not just in terms of climate protection, but well, also on the topic of the bike, just to look at where components come from. Do we have such a thing as a purely European bike? Not that I could answer that, but just maybe ask yourselves these questions. And I believe that this will take time sometimes, but then you can support European-based companies. It might be a little bit uncomfortable, and maybe it might be slower. For our association, it would be helpful if it wasn't just the DIHK, the German Commercial Chamber, explaining and telling us what the economy needs. So other voices should become a little bit stronger and louder. And then, of course, I agree with the previous speaker about the federal elections.
Ja, es gibt wirklich so viel, und weil das eben so viel
There's
ist,
so
habe ich
much we can
jetzt
do.
noch mal so einen kleinen Werbeblock, Klammer auf, Klammer zu, ein ganzes Buch dazu geschrieben, was
And I
jeder
wrote a whole
Einzelne tun
book
kann, um
about
was zu
it,
verändern. 50 Tipps habe
where
ich
there are
da drin,
50
aber
tips as to
muss man
what
nicht alle durchgehen.
each
Viel
and
wurde
every
schon
one
genannt,
of us can
so
do.
die typischen
A lot has already been
Kaufkonsum oder
mentioned.
regionale Produkte und so weiter.
Ecological
Das weiß ja, glaube ich,
electricity or buying
mittlerweile auch
regional
jeder,
products. I
aber
think everyone
Wahl
knows
ist
this
schon
by
ein
now.
wichtiges Stichwort, was so Dinge sind, die man gar nicht oder die unterm Radar so laufen, ist eben auch, was ich da empfohlen habe, auch Transparenz oft einzufordern. Sei es jetzt
I
in
also
dem Unternehmen, in dem man
recommend
arbeitet,
asking
im
for
Verein oder
transparency,
in
be
der
it in the
Schule,
company you
wo man
work for or
fragt,
at
was sind
school
eigentlich
or in your
eure
club.
Ziele, wie viel
Simply
Emissionen
ask, what
verursachen
are
wir
your
hier
goals?
eigentlich oder können
How
wir
many
zusammensetzen,
emissions
Ideen zu
are we
sammeln,
causing?
auch mal
Can we come
gemeinschaftlich Dinge
together
zu
to collect
verändern.
ideas, to
Zumindest ist
change
der Weg
things
immer
as
aus
a
dieser
community?
Lethargie heraus, dass
So this
man
is kind of
Lösungen
a way of
schafft,
leaving
nicht nur für
behind
sich selber, sondern
lethargy.
sich
It's all
anschließt
about
an
finding solutions, not
Bürgerbeteiligung wurde schon
necessarily
genannt,
by
aber auch in
yourself, but also by
Vereinen,
joining
Ideen schafft und
clubs and
sich
associations
zusammentut,
to come
um
about
gemeinschaftlich
with
zu
good
wirken. Und
ideas
das finde ich
in
ganz
order to
wichtig,
have
weil
an
das
effect
wissen wir aus der
together.
Psychologie, dass das
This
hilft
is extremely
und
important.
auch
We
gerade
know
in
from
diesen Zeiten, wo es
psychology
nicht
that this
zu
is
gehen,
extremely
dass man
helpful,
da einfach sich zusammentut,
especially
egal
in
wo,
times of
im
crises.
Verein, in der
It's
Schule, in
great
der
to come
Nachbarschaft, Kirche,
together
wo auch immer.
in
Man
the
sich da gerne
church,
trifft,
at
die
school,
Dinge
in your club.
anzugehen
So
und das
get
gemeinschaftlich
together
anzugehen.
to
Im
tackle
Übrigen auch, wenn man
problems.
jetzt nochmal Finanzen angeht,
And
auch
when it
da
comes
hat
to
jeder
funding,
selber es in der Hand, die Bank zu
when it
wählen
comes
und
to
auch
money,
darauf achten,
everyone
welche
can
Werte da im
choose
Hintergrund sind, als zwei
a
Beispiele.
bank.
Nicht
And
jeder
for
hat Kapital,
example,
um
a based on what values a certain bank stands for. So these types of decisions are extremely important on all levels. Thank you. Perhaps I can also say something as a moderator.
Und Nathan war auch Referent.
And Nathan was also one of the speakers. Nathan, apologies, I forgot you. Please do go ahead. No worries. I was still thinking about the question whether we have a European bicycle. Hopefully that will be our next commission paper. Now with regards to what we can do, a lot of things have already been mentioned. When this green steel was mentioned by Merz, it was great to see that there was immediate backlash, and that is something we can all cultivate. We need to develop an investment mindset where we don't only pay attention to the cost, but also to what we get. Investing into green steel offers competitiveness. It's also security political investment. And that's also why we framed it this way in our presentation. These supply chain standards, this more ethical production mean, all of these are investments. There's a lithium mine in Serbia, in the Jada Valley, for example, where everything was done wrong pretty much, even though we urgently need it. But there's a lot of opposition there. There could be a referendum and protests because it isn't being done in a social, ecological manner. So we shouldn't only pay attention to the costs, we should also think about what is the result of these investments. And we shouldn't only follow people blindly who say this is going to cost too much money. Thank you very much. You added a whole lot of things. The backlash against the backlash could be the motto of the Goodforces. You're sort of the backlash against the backlash. I like that. I should put a patent on it and sell it to you. No. Just joking. But what Claudia Kemfert said is extremely important to me too. I live in Düsseldorf and I'm very active at a local level. And this is extremely important. Of course, climate protection seems to take place at a very high level, many think, but it does start at home. It starts in your enterprise. There's so many areas where you can get together. That's an extremely important point. And that's also why we do Europe Calling. We want to provide you with information, we want to give you ideas and visions, things that you can then also pass on. So that is always our plea. Do use it, do spread it, do have these unpleasant discussions at the table with said uncle or aunt, we all know them. And affordability was mentioned, and this is extremely important because people that have to do 2 jobs to get by, they cannot have all these thoughts. They also cannot join our webinar in the evening because they're simply still working, because they're currently still busy with their second job. And that's something we should be aware of. Many of us that have these discussions are in extremely privileged situations to even be able to think about this. So when it comes to the elections, it is also interesting to think about who is talking about social matters, who is talking about making things affordable, who talks about prices. Because, yeah, okay, we can produce solar panels here, but then they're going to be a whole lot more expensive. And somebody who has 2 jobs won't be able to afford photovoltaic panels on his or her roof. So that too is a topic that we need to talk about in more detail. All the things we've discussed today cannot lead to fewer people being able to join in. That would be my closing remark. A big thank you to our 4 guests. Thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you to everyone asking questions. Do spread the information. Europe Calling will continue next Wednesday. Tomorrow you'll be invited to a big webinar on health and chemical policy I'm sure you all heard what is going on with PFAS, with these forever chemicals, and on Wednesday at 6 p.m. there will be the next webinar. You'll all be sent the link. Hopefully see you there. A very good evening, and also a thank you to the interpreters. Bye-bye.
Danke, tschüss.
Tschüss.
Schönen Abend.